This begins lesson 26 of our Old Testament survey. In this lesson, we will be covering the Old Testament book of Lamentations, or as it is written in your King James Bible, the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is obviously the writer, regardless of what the critics from the Jewish Christian community of scholars say by way of their traditions. We know what Jesus Christ thinks about the traditions of men when we read Mark chapter 7. Now, Jeremiah is not only a prophet, but he is a poet who writes with first-hand knowledge and experience over the events that took place during the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. You can see this by reading Lamentations chapter 3, verses 55 through 62, and Jeremiah chapter number 6, verse number 26. Now, Jeremiah does not write the book of Lamentations with an "I told you so" attitude, but rather he writes with an attitude of sorrow and repentance over Jerusalem's sorrows. Lamentations has 5 chapters, which represents the number of death, 154 verses, and 3,411 words. Something that is peculiar in the book of Lamentations, and only happens in 2 other places, is that chapter 3 of Lamentations has 66 verses, matching the 66 books in your King James Bible. This is also true of 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 66, and Matthew 27 and verse 66. Now, chapter 3 and verse 66 of Lamentations represents the destruction of Jerusalem. The 66 verses in 1 Kings chapter 8 pictures the time of eternity with the new heavens and the new earth. And the 66 verses in Matthew 27 speaks of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. Now, Lamentations has a dual application regarding the nation of Israel. One is that of her destruction historically under Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. The other is that of her destruction prophetically in the future during the Great Tribulation under the hand of the Son of Perdition. There are also great spiritual applications and salient verses for the Christian found in Lamentations, specifically chapter number 3, again, which has 66 verses. So that shows you that the entire Bible is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. Now there are 5 elegies, with each chapter being an elegy. An elegy is defined as one who speaks out or cries out in a wailing or mournful poem like a funeral song. So there being 5 chapters in the book of Lamentations, it is in fact a 5-chapter funeral song. These 5 elegies or laments are like this. Chapter 1 is the general lament over Jerusalem's afflictions. Chapter 2 is the detailed lament over Jerusalem's destruction as a result of their sin. The 3rd elegy is the explained lament over the underlying factors of Jerusalem's fall. The 4th elegy is the learned lament over lessons learned from Jerusalem's judgment. And the 5th and final lament, the mournful song, is the prayerful lament over Jerusalem's restoration by God's grace and mercy. Now, from these laments or elegies, and from other men in the Bible who had similar laments like Nehemiah and Daniel, the Christian can see 3 important truths. Number 1, God deals with sin through his righteous judgments. Number 2, the believer should deal with his sin before judgment falls on him. And then number 3, the afflicted should humble himself and confess his sin in prayer to God for mercy and forgiveness. This we can see in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, and Hebrews chapter number 12, verses 5 to 13. And then also this can be seen in James, chapter number 4, and verses 5 to 10. Now the fall of Jerusalem will be the fall of any nation, including America. That is, when the religious leaders of that nation come short and fail in their responsibility to preach the truth according to the Scriptures. We see this in Lamentations chapter number 2 and verse 14. Thy prophets have seen vain and foolish things for thee, and they have not discovered thine iniquity, to turn away thy captivity, but have seen for thee false burdens and causes of banishment. All that pass by clap their hands at thee, they hiss and wag their head at the daughter of Jerusalem, saying, Is this the city that men call the perfection of beauty, the joy of the whole earth? Paul writes it this way in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now I will give you the outline to the entire book of Lamentations. As I said, there are only 5 chapters. Now the first chapter will give you the reason for Jerusalem's afflictions. In verses 1 to 7, we see the explication of Jerusalem's afflictions. In verses 8 to 18, we see the explanation of Jerusalem's afflictions. And then in verses 19 to 22, we see the effect of Jerusalem's afflictions. In chapter 2, we see the reality of Jerusalem's afflictions. Verses 1 to 8, we have Jerusalem's adversary. Verses 9 to 16, we have Jerusalem's agony. And verses 17 to 22, we find Jerusalem's appeal. In chapter 3, we read about the root of Jerusalem's afflictions. In verses 1 to 20, we read about the rod of God's wrath. In verses 21 to 39, the riches of God's mercy. In verses 40 to 54, the righteousness of God's judgments. And in verses 55 to 66, the repentance of God's people. In chapter 4, we read about the recognition of Jerusalem's afflictions. Verses 1 to 12, we find the vanity of human glory. Verses 13 to 16, the vanity of human leadership. Verses 17 to 20, the vanity of human resources. And then lastly, in chapter 4, verses 21 to 22, the vanity of human pride. And that's never more on display than this month, the month of June. Then lastly, chapter 5, we read about the results of Jerusalem's afflictions. First, Jerusalem beseeches God's grace in verses 1 to 18. And then secondly, Jerusalem beseeches God's glory in verses 19 to 22. A short book, a short survey, a short overview and outline, but there's a lot of prophetical material and practical material and historical material by Jeremiah the writer, the weeping prophet. Until next time, may God bless.